They laughed because they saw an old man. They stopped laughing when they realized they were standing in front of history. The Saturday morning competition at Black Ridge Shooting Club had always drawn a crowd, but that morning felt different before anyone even knew why. Pickup trucks filled the gravel parking lot, families gathered behind the safety fence with coffee cups in hand, and competitors adjusted expensive rifles that gleamed beneath the bright summer sun. The prize was modest, but the real attraction was the chance to break a local precision shooting record that had remained untouched for 40 years. Every serious marksman in 3 neighboring counties knew the number by heart, yet every year someone tried, and every year they failed. Ethan Brooks, the club's confident 38-year-old range master, walked the firing line wearing mirrored sunglasses and a crisp black polo embroidered with the club logo. He enjoyed the attention that came with running the event and greeted the competitors with easy confidence. As another truck rolled into the lot, few people bothered to look. An elderly man stepped out slowly, closed the truck door with care, and lifted an old wooden rifle case from the passenger seat. His faded denim jacket had clearly seen decades of use, and his worn leather boots carried the dust of countless miles. His silver hair peeked out beneath a weathered baseball cap, and every movement reflected patience instead of urgency. Walter Hayes paused for a moment to take in the familiar scent of cut grass, fresh coffee, and gun oil before making his way toward the registration table. Several younger competitors exchanged amused smiles. One whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "Looks like Grandpa got lost on his way to the History Museum." A few people chuckled. Walter simply smiled politely and continued walking. Ethan noticed him approaching and glanced at the old rifle case with obvious skepticism. "Morning, sir," he said with a grin that barely concealed his amusement. "Spectators are over there if you're just here to watch." Walter shook his head gently. "I'm here to compete." Ethan blinked for a second before laughing softly. "You're serious?" Walter nodded once. "Completely." Ethan picked up the registration form and handed it across the table. "Well, everyone's welcome to try. Just don't expect miracles today. This course isn't easy." Walter accepted the clipboard without changing his calm expression. "I never expect miracles," he replied. "Only honest results." Ethan watched the old man sign his name in neat handwriting before checking the competitor list. "Walter Hayes," he read aloud. The name meant nothing to him. He shrugged and clipped the form onto the stack. "You'll be shooting last." One of the younger competitors laughed. "Good idea. Gives him time to rest." More laughter spread through the group. Walter thanked Ethan, picked up his rifle case, and quietly walked toward an empty bench beneath a large oak tree. He opened the weathered case with surprising care. Inside rested a rifle that looked almost as old as the man carrying it, spotless despite its age, every piece maintained with remarkable precision. Walter carefully wiped the barrel with a clean cloth before looking across the range. He did not study the targets first. Instead, he watched the tall grass bending with the breeze, the small flags fluttering above each lane, and the slow movement of clouds crossing the morning sky. While others talked loudly about expensive optics and custom ammunition, Walter listened only to the wind. His calm eyes measured details no one else seemed to notice. Nearby, a teenage competitor struggled to steady his breathing while adjusting his scope. Walter observed quietly but said nothing. Around him, conversations continued, most of them dismissive. "He won't even hit paper," someone joked. "Maybe they should move the target closer." Ethan heard every comment and never bothered to stop them. In his mind, the old man was simply another hobbyist chasing a memory that no longer existed. What none of them realized was that Walter had not come to relive the past. He had come because he believed respect was never demanded, never borrowed, and never given freely. It was earned one steady breath, one careful decision, and sometimes, one unforgettable shot at a time. The first relay stepped onto the firing line as the range fell into disciplined silence, broken only by the distant rustle of trees and the occasional call of a bird overhead. Ethan Brooks gave the safety instructions with practiced confidence, then signaled for the competition to begin. One by one, skilled shooters fired carefully measured groups, earning respectful applause whenever someone produced an impressive score. Walter Hayes remained seated beneath the oak tree, his rifle resting across the open case while he quietly observed every detail unfolding before him. He watched how each competitor reacted after a good shot and how quickly frustration appeared after a poor one. More importantly, he watched the changing breeze. Every few minutes the small range flags shifted direction just enough to matter at long distance. Most competitors noticed only the obvious gusts. Walter noticed every subtle movement. Between relays, several younger shooters gathered near the refreshment table where cold lemonade and bottled water were available for participants. Their conversation soon drifted back toward the elderly man waiting patiently for his turn. One competitor shook his head with a grin. "I still cannot believe he actually signed up." Another laughed. "Maybe he thinks experience beats modern equipment." A third replied, "Not today. Those old rifles belong in a display case." Their laughter carried farther than they realized. Walter heard every word but never looked in their direction. Instead, he carefully adjusted the leather sling attached to his rifle before closing his eyes for a brief moment, breathing slowly and evenly. Ethan walked past and glanced toward Walter once again. "Comfortable over there, Mr. Hayes?" he asked with a friendly smile that still carried a hint of sarcasm. Walter opened his eyes. "Very comfortable." Ethan folded his arms. "You know this course runs out to 600 yards. That is a long distance, especially with shifting wind." Walter nodded. "The wind usually tells you exactly what it plans to do. You only have to listen." Ethan smiled politely, assuming the answer was nothing more than an old man's philosophy. "Well, I hope it talks to you." "Today," Walter answered with another quiet smile. "It always does." Ethan walked away, shaking his head. As the competition continued, scores climbed steadily, but none came close to threatening the legendary record posted on the large scoreboard near the clubhouse. Every attempt seemed to end with one or two shots drifting just far enough from center to end any serious challenge. Spectators applauded solid performances while quietly accepting that another year would likely pass without history being made. A teenage competitor named Logan returned from his lane looking disappointed after missing several difficult shots. As he walked past Walter, the older man spoke for the first time without being addressed. "May I ask you something?" Logan stopped respectfully. "Sure." Walter looked toward the distant flags instead of the young man. "Before your fourth shot, what changed?" Logan frowned. "I do not know. I guess I pulled the trigger." Walter gently shook his head. "The wind shifted from your left to almost straight ahead for about 3 seconds. You never looked at the flags." Logan stared at him with surprise. "You noticed that from here?" Walter simply nodded. "The target always tells the truth, but the wind tells the story first." Logan looked back toward the firing line, replaying the moment in his mind, and slowly realized the old man was exactly right. Before he could ask another question, officials announced the final relay before lunch. Ethan checked his clipboard, then glanced toward Walter. "Looks like you are still waiting, Mr. Hayes. You will close out the afternoon after everyone else finishes." Gives the crowd one last bit of entertainment. Several nearby competitors chuckled again. Walter stood carefully, lifted his rifle case with steady hands, and walked toward the benches closer to the firing line. He did not respond to the laughter. He simply looked once more at the distant flags, the sunlight reflecting across the range, and the clouds moving almost imperceptibly across the open sky. For the first time that morning, Logan watched Walter instead of the scoreboard, and a quiet feeling settled over him that the oldest competitor at Black Ridge Shooting Club might also be the only person there who already knew exactly how the day would end. As the lunch break ended, competitors slowly returned to the firing line with renewed determination, yet an unmistakable feeling of resignation had settled across Black Ridge Shooting Club. The highest score of the morning was impressive by any ordinary standard, but it still fell well short of the legendary mark displayed on the weathered scoreboard beside the clubhouse. Spectators chatted casually, convinced that another year would pass without history changing. Ethan Brooks checked the remaining names on his clipboard and smiled when he saw only one competitor left. "Looks like we saved the most experienced gentleman for the grand finale," he announced with playful confidence. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Walter Hayes rose from the wooden bench beneath the oak tree with the same calm pace he had maintained since arriving that morning. He carried his old rifle case to the preparation table without the slightest sign of hurry. Several people expected nervousness from a man his age standing before such a crowd, but Walter showed none. He unlocked the case, carefully lifted out the rifle, and began inspecting it with patient precision. Every movement appeared deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though he had repeated the same routine thousands of times before. Logan watched from only a few feet away, unable to hide his curiosity. "Sir?" he asked quietly. "How long have you owned that rifle?" Walter smiled without looking up. "Long enough to know that it deserves respect." Logan nodded. "Does it still shoot as well as the new ones?" Walter gently ran a clean cloth along the stock before answering. "A rifle only performs as well as the person behind it. New tools do not replace steady hands." Logan considered those words carefully. Nearby, two competitors overheard the conversation and exchanged amused looks. One whispered, "Sounds like something printed on a calendar." The other chuckled, but Logan no longer joined the laughter. Something about Walter no longer matched the harmless image everyone had created that morning. Ethan stepped forward and began preparing Walter's lane. 600 yards, he reminded him. Changing wind. Bright afternoon sun. It is a challenging combination. Walter glanced toward the distant target before lifting his eyes to the range flags. The conditions are actually improving. Ethan laughed softly. Improving for who? Walter answered simply. For anyone willing to pay attention. Ethan shrugged, unconvinced. While officials verified the target and electronic scoring system, Walter remained perfectly still. He did not adjust his scope repeatedly like many competitors had done. He did not pace nervously. Instead, he watched the field beyond the firing line where tall grass swayed in slow, uneven patterns. A small hawk circled high overhead before disappearing beyond the trees. The sunlight briefly slipped behind a passing cloud, softening the glare across the range. Walter quietly inhaled, then exhaled at an even rhythm that never changed. Logan noticed every detail. You have not looked through your scope yet, he said. Walter smiled. The target has not moved. The world around it has. Those words lingered in Logan's mind. For the first time all day, he realized Walter was preparing for far more than a simple shooting competition. Ethan raised his voice so the crowd could hear. Ladies and gentlemen, our final competitor is ready. Let us give him a warm welcome. Polite applause followed, though scattered laughter remained. Walter stepped onto the firing line carrying the rifle with quiet confidence, his posture straight despite his age. He settled into position with practiced ease, resting the rifle against its support as naturally as someone setting down a favorite book. Before touching the trigger, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, listening not to the crowd but to the gentle wind crossing the valley. The conversations behind him slowly faded as spectators became unexpectedly silent. Even those who had mocked him found themselves watching more closely. There was nothing dramatic about Walter's movements, yet every action carried an unmistakable sense of discipline refined over countless years. Ethan glanced toward the scoring officials, expecting an ordinary performance that would bring the competition to a routine conclusion. Instead, an unusual feeling settled over the range, as though everyone present sensed they were about to witness something they could never fully explain until it had already happened. Walter Hayes slowly settled behind the rifle as the final relay officially began. The entire range seemed to grow quieter with every passing second. Even those who had been talking moments earlier lowered their voices without realizing it. Ethan Brooks raised one hand toward the line officials, received confirmation that every safety check had been completed, then announced, The range is clear. Shooter, you may begin whenever you are ready. Walter did not move immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the distant flags instead of the target. A light breeze drifted across the 600-yard lane, then weakened almost completely before changing direction by only a few degrees. Most people would never have noticed. Walter waited another moment until the grass at the edge of the field settled into a familiar pattern. Only then did he place his cheek gently against the rifle stock and look through the scope for the very first time. Logan stood behind the spectator line, holding his breath without knowing why. Ethan folded his arms with quiet confidence, still expecting nothing more than an ordinary finish to an ordinary competition. Walter inhaled slowly, paused, then released half of his breath. His finger rested lightly against the trigger without the slightest hint of tension. The first shot echoed across the valley with a clean, sharp report. Every eye immediately turned toward the electronic scoreboard. For a brief second, nobody spoke. Then the number appeared. Perfect center. A murmur swept through the crowd. Ethan looked from the screen to the distant target, and back again. "Nice shot," he admitted with an approving nod. "A lucky start." Walter calmly worked the action and prepared for the next round without reacting to either the score or the comment. Once again he watched the flags instead of rushing the shot. The breeze shifted slightly, then steadied. He pressed the trigger with the same controlled motion. The second shot broke the afternoon's silence. Seconds later, another perfect center appeared on the scoreboard. This time the murmurs became louder. Several competitors exchanged uncertain glances. One quietly said, "That cannot be coincidence." Ethan forced a small smile. "Two good shots do not win competitions." Walter remained completely focused. His heartbeat appeared as steady as his breathing. He neither celebrated nor hurried. Each movement followed the same rhythm, almost like a practice routine that had been refined over a lifetime. Before the third shot, a stronger gust crossed the range, causing several spectators to expect the bullet to drift. Walter lowered the rifle slightly instead of firing. He waited. 5 long seconds passed. The wind softened. He raised the rifle again. The third shot rang out. Another perfect center. The spectators fell almost completely silent. Logan slowly turned toward Ethan, whose confident expression had begun to fade. Ethan walked toward the scoring officials and quietly asked them to confirm the electronic readings. They reviewed the display, verified the equipment, and nodded. Everything was functioning exactly as expected. Walter continued without acknowledging the growing tension around him. His fourth shot landed so close to the previous 3 that the electronic display enlarged the impact pattern to distinguish the nearly overlapping holes. A judge leaned closer to the monitor, blinking twice before reading the measurements aloud. The grouping was unlike anything recorded that day. Conversations disappeared entirely. Even the children watching beside their parents stopped talking. Walter rested the rifle for a moment, and looked toward the distant flags again. There was no excitement on his face, only quiet concentration. Logan realized something remarkable. Walter was not trying to defeat the other competitors. He was competing against a standard that existed only in his own mind. Ethan stepped closer to the firing line than he had with any previous shooter. The playful smile that had greeted Walter that morning was gone, replaced by genuine curiosity mixed with growing disbelief. As Walter prepared for the next shot, the scoreboard displayed a flawless sequence that no competitor had managed in decades, and for the first time all afternoon, no one at Black Ridge Shooting Club was thinking about the old man's age. They were all wondering the same question. Who exactly was Walter Hayes? The silence that settled over Black Ridge Shooting Club after Walter Hayes's fourth perfect shot felt heavier than any applause could have been. Only an hour earlier, people had smiled politely at the sight of an elderly man carrying a worn wooden rifle case across the parking lot. Now every eye remained fixed on him, waiting to see whether the impossible performance would finally begin to fade. Walter never looked toward the scoreboard. He simply rested the rifle across its support, observed the movement of the range flags once again, and waited with remarkable patience. Ethan Brooks stared at the electronic display before turning toward the scoring officials. "Run another verification," he said quietly. One official looked surprised. "The system already confirmed every shot." Ethan nodded. "Do it again anyway." Within moments the technicians completed another diagnostic. Every sensor reported normal operation. The impacts matched the readings perfectly. Nothing was malfunctioning. Ethan thanked them, but the confidence that had defined his morning was beginning to disappear. Walter resumed his position behind the rifle. The afternoon breeze became slightly stronger, causing several experienced competitors to whisper among themselves. "This is where the streak ends," one man said confidently. "Nobody keeps that kind of group once the wind starts moving." Walter watched the grass ripple across the open field, then lowered his breathing until even Logan could barely see his shoulders move. Another clean report echoed across the valley. The scoreboard refreshed almost instantly. Perfect center. A wave of disbelief swept through the spectators. Someone removed his sunglasses just to stare more carefully at the screen. Another competitor quietly shook his head and muttered, "That cannot be happening." Ethan immediately walked to the spotting scope position beside the officials and personally examined the distant target. The impact matched the electronic display exactly. He stepped back without saying a word. Walter calmly prepared for the next shot. Every movement remained identical to the one before it. There was no celebration after success, and no visible pressure as expectations grew higher. He simply continued following the same rhythm, allowing the conditions to settle before pressing the trigger once again. Another shot. Another perfect score. The crowd no longer whispered. They simply watched. Logan realized that nobody was laughing anymore. The same competitors who had joked about Walter's age now stood with folded arms and serious expressions, studying every detail of his technique. One older spectator quietly said, "Look at his breathing. It never changes." Another replied, "I have been shooting here for 30 years. I have never seen anyone this disciplined." Ethan looked toward the chief judge. "I want the target inspected between rounds." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You think there is a problem?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "I do not know what to think." Officials drove a utility vehicle to the target line, while the audience waited in complete silence. Several minutes later they returned carrying photographs, measurements, and confirmation that every impact was genuine. There was no equipment failure, no scoring error, and no sign of tampering. Everything about Walter's performance was authentic. Ethan thanked the officials, but his expression revealed growing uncertainty. He approached Walter with a respectful tone that had not existed earlier that morning. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "would you mind if we checked your rifle before you continue?" Walter looked up with calm eyes and smiled gently. "Not at all." He handed over the rifle without hesitation. Two experienced armorers examined the barrel, the sights, the trigger, and every visible component. They measured tolerances, confirmed the optics, and inspected the ammunition Walter had brought with him. After several careful minutes, one armorer handed the rifle back. "Everything is completely legal," he announced. "In fact, this rifle is older than many people standing here, but it has been maintained with exceptional care." Walter accepted it with a quiet nod. "Thank you." Ethan took one slow breath before addressing the spectators. "The inspection is complete. The competition will continue." As Walter returned to the firing position, something remarkable had changed across the entire range. The elderly man who had arrived as an object of amusement had become the center of absolute attention, and for the first time that day, every competitor understood they were no longer watching someone chase an old record. They were watching someone who seemed to know exactly how to reach it. Walter Hayes accepted the rifle from the armorer with the same quiet gratitude he had shown all morning, then returned to the firing line without a trace of excitement on his face. The inspection had changed nothing except the atmosphere surrounding him. Every spectator now leaned forward with complete attention, and even the competitors who had once dismissed him stood in respectful silence. Ethan Brooks stepped back beside the scoring officials, no longer wearing the confident smile that had greeted Walter earlier that day. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on the elderly man as though he were trying to solve a mystery that refused to reveal itself. "The range is clear," Ethan announced. "You may continue." Walter settled into position once more. He studied the distant flags for several seconds, waiting patiently while a brief crosswind drifted through the valley. He did not chase perfect conditions. He simply recognized the exact moment when the changing air became predictable. His breathing slowed until it appeared almost effortless. The next shot echoed across the range. Every head turned toward the electronic scoreboard before the sound had fully disappeared. Another perfect center. A few spectators instinctively applauded before stopping themselves, unwilling to interrupt the extraordinary concentration unfolding before them. Walter calmly chambered another round. Logan watched every movement with complete fascination. The older man's routine never varied by even a fraction. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary adjustment, and no visible emotion. It was the quiet confidence of someone who trusted decades of disciplined practice more than adrenaline. Another measured breath. Another smooth trigger press. Another clean report. The scoreboard refreshed again. Perfect center. The chief judge slowly lowered his clipboard and stared at the display in disbelief. One official quietly compared the running score against the historical records stored in the club database. After several moments, he looked toward Ethan with widened eyes but said nothing. Ethan walked over immediately. "What is it?" he asked. The official swallowed before answering. "If Mr. Hayes completes his remaining shots at this pace, the 40-year record is gone." Ethan looked back toward Walter, unable to hide his astonishment. The elderly competitor remained completely unaware of the conversation behind him, or perhaps he simply chose not to acknowledge it. His attention never left the range. The final shots approached. Every person present understood that they were witnessing something extraordinarily rare. Families who had begun gathering their belongings stopped and returned to the spectator line. Competitors who had already packed their equipment quietly reopened their cases just to continue watching. Even the breeze seemed gentler as Walter prepared for another attempt. He waited only a moment before pressing the trigger once again. Perfect center. The scoreboard now displayed numbers that no one had expected to see in their lifetime. The chief judge immediately recalculated the total by hand before comparing it with the electronic system. Both matched exactly. A deep silence settled across Black Ridge Shooting Club as Walter prepared for what could become the final shot of the afternoon. Ethan found himself unconsciously holding his breath along with everyone else. Walter looked through the scope one final time. The distant target remained perfectly still. The flags drifted gently before pausing almost completely. Walter exhaled halfway, held steady, and completed the trigger press with remarkable control. The final shot rang across the valley. For several endless seconds, nobody moved. Then the electronic scoreboard updated. A perfect center. The chief judge stared at the display before removing his glasses and reading the final score again. His voice trembled as he spoke into the public address microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, after complete verification by both electronic and manual scoring, we officially confirm that a new club record has been established today. The previous record, which stood unbroken for 40 years, has been surpassed." The announcement was followed by complete silence, not because people doubted the result, but because they were struggling to understand what they had just witnessed. Then applause erupted across the range, growing louder with every passing second until the entire valley echoed with cheers. Walter simply stood, lifted his rifle from the bench, and offered a small grateful smile. He accepted neither celebration nor attention, as though breaking a record had never been his true purpose. Yet, while the applause continued, an even greater surprise quietly waited inside the club archives, one that would soon force everyone present, especially Ethan Brooks, to rethink everything they believed they knew about the quiet old man standing before them. The applause continued long after the final score had been announced, yet Walter Hayes remained exactly as he had been throughout the day, calm, humble, and quietly grateful. He carefully opened the worn wooden rifle case, wiped the rifle with the same clean cloth, and gently secured it inside as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Around him, competitors who had laughed only hours before now stood in respectful silence, unsure of what to say. Ethan Brooks looked from Walter to the scoreboard again, struggling to accept that the elderly man he had nearly mistaken for a spectator had just accomplished something none of the club's finest marksmen had managed in 4 decades. The chief judge walked into the clubhouse to retrieve the official record book, wanting to document every detail before the excitement settled. A few minutes later he returned carrying an old leather binder with yellowed pages that contained decades of competition history. He placed it on the registration table and slowly turned page after page while several officials gathered around. "We should record today's result next to the old record," one official said. The chief judge nodded and found the correct page. As he compared the numbers, his expression suddenly changed. His finger remained frozen on one line while his eyes widened with disbelief. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is wrong?" he asked. The chief judge looked up without speaking for several seconds. Then he quietly turned the binder around so everyone could see. Written beside the previous record, established exactly 40 years earlier, was a name. Walter Hayes. Complete silence swept across the range once again. Ethan stared at the page, then slowly turned toward Walter, who had just finished closing his rifle case. "That cannot be right," Ethan whispered. The chief judge checked the page again before answering. "It is correct. The record that stood for 40 years belonged to Walter Hayes." The words spread through the crowd almost instantly. Competitors who had been packing their equipment stopped what they were doing. Spectators stepped closer to hear better. Logan looked from the record book to Walter with genuine amazement. "You mean he did not just break the record?" he said softly. "He broke his own record." The chief judge nodded. "Yes. The man everyone watched today is the same man who set the standard 40 years ago." Ethan slowly walked toward Walter, unable to hide the disbelief on his face. "Mr. Hayes?" he asked respectfully. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Walter looked at him with a gentle smile. "Because the target does not care who you used to be. It only tells the truth about who you are today." Before Ethan could respond, an older man stepped forward from the crowd. His back was slightly bent with age, but his eyes immediately brightened when he saw Walter. "Walter?" he called. Walter turned and smiled warmly. "Frank Donovan." The two elderly men shook hands like friends who had not seen each other in years. Frank laughed softly. "I knew I recognized your shooting style. I watched you compete here when I was a young volunteer. People came from 3 states just to see you shoot." Ethan listened in complete silence. Frank continued. "Back then everyone talked about your patience more than your accuracy. They said you never fought the wind. You waited until it became your partner." Logan looked at Walter with growing admiration. "Were you famous?" Walter chuckled quietly and shook his head. "For a little while, perhaps. Then life moved on. I served my country, raised my family, built a career, and eventually stopped competing. Records belong to history. Living belongs to today." Frank smiled. "You left before anyone could replace your standard. We always wondered if someone would finally break it." Walter glanced once toward the scoreboard before answering. "Someone finally did." Ethan looked at him with confusion. "You mean you?" Walter gently shook his head. "No. I am not the same man who stood here 40 years ago. That young competitor belonged to another chapter of life. Today I simply tried to honor what he started." Those words settled deeply into everyone listening. The afternoon had begun with laughter directed at an elderly stranger carrying an old rifle. It had become a lesson about humility, discipline, and the quiet strength of experience. Yet Ethan could not stop thinking about his own words from that morning, and he realized that the greatest challenge waiting for him was no longer understanding Walter's remarkable skill. It was finding the courage to admit how completely he had judged the wrong man. The conversations around Black Ridge Shooting Club slowly resumed, but they sounded completely different from the ones that had filled the range only a few hours earlier. The laughter had disappeared, replaced by quiet admiration and thoughtful reflection. Competitors who had arrived hoping to challenge an old record now found themselves discussing discipline, patience, and humility instead of equipment or scores. Walter Hayes stood beside the registration table speaking with Frank Donovan while several younger shooters respectfully waited for an opportunity to introduce themselves. Ethan Brooks remained several steps away, staring at the weathered record book that still lay open to the page bearing Walter's name twice, once as the young man who had established the legendary score and once again as the older man who had finally surpassed it. After several long moments, Ethan closed the binder carefully and walked toward Walter. The confidence that usually defined his posture had been replaced by quiet sincerity. He stopped a few feet away and removed his sunglasses before speaking. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I owe you an apology." Walter turned toward him with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the day. Ethan continued, "This morning I saw your age before I saw you. I assumed you were here for nostalgia instead of competition. I laughed when I should have welcomed you with respect. I was wrong." The surrounding conversations faded as people realized what was happening. Walter looked at Ethan for a moment before offering a warm smile. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "It takes character to admit when we make a mistake." Ethan lowered his head slightly. "I hope you can forgive me." Walter nodded without hesitation. "There is nothing to forgive. Every person makes quick judgments sometimes. The important part is deciding whether we learn from them." Ethan let out a slow breath, visibly relieved. "I learned more today than I have in years of running this range." Logan stepped closer, unable to hide his curiosity. "Mr. Hayes?" he asked respectfully. "How did you stay so calm when everyone was making jokes about you?" Walter looked toward the distant targets before answering. "Because I did not come here to change anyone's opinion with words. Opinions built on appearances usually disappear the moment truth arrives." Logan considered those words carefully. "Were you never angry?" Walter smiled gently. "Anger uses energy that concentration needs. If I had spent the morning proving people wrong, I would not have had enough focus to prove myself right." Several competitors quietly nodded. One older shooter removed his cap and said, "That may be the best advice I have heard in a long time." Walter continued, "Experience teaches something many people discover too late. Respect cannot be demanded, and reputation cannot shoot a target. Every new day asks the same question. Can you still perform with discipline when nobody expects anything from you?" Ethan listened without interrupting. He realized those words described much more than shooting. They described leadership, work, family, and life itself. Frank Donovan smiled proudly. "You always had a way of teaching without sounding like a teacher." Walter laughed softly. "Life handled most of the teaching. I only paid attention." A group of younger competitors gathered around Walter and began asking questions about breathing, patience, and reading the wind. He answered each one with genuine kindness, never mentioning the record unless someone else brought it up. To him, sharing knowledge seemed far more valuable than celebrating personal achievement. Ethan watched the scene unfold with growing admiration. Earlier that morning he had believed the competition existed to honor great scores. Now he understood it should honor the character behind those scores as well. Looking around at the crowd, he realized every person present would leave with the memory of remarkable marksmanship, but the lesson they would remember for years would have nothing to do with numbers. It would be the quiet example of an elderly veteran who never answered mockery with pride, never answered doubt with anger, and never needed recognition to demonstrate the true value of experience. As the afternoon sun slowly settled behind the hills surrounding Black Ridge Shooting Club, the excitement of the competition gradually gave way to quiet reflection. Families began gathering their chairs, competitors packed away expensive equipment, and volunteers folded tables that had been busy since early morning. Yet very few people seemed eager to leave. Small groups remained scattered across the grounds, continuing to talk about the remarkable performance they had witnessed, but even more often they spoke about the man behind it. Walter Hayes finished answering one final question from a young competitor before gently closing the lid of his weathered rifle case. He thanked each person who had approached him, shook every offered hand, and treated the newest shooter with exactly the same respect he gave the most experienced one. Ethan Brooks watched from a short distance before walking toward the clubhouse entrance. A few minutes later he returned carrying a framed photograph that had hung inside the building for years. The photograph showed a much younger champion standing proudly beside the very same firing line decades earlier. Dust had slightly faded the image, but the face was unmistakable. Walter smiled softly when Ethan placed the frame on the table between them. "I wondered where that picture disappeared to," Walter said with a quiet laugh. Ethan looked at him with sincere respect. "It should never have been forgotten." He turned toward the crowd and raised the photograph high enough for everyone to see. "Today reminded me that records matter, but the people who create them matter even more. Starting next season, this competition will no longer simply be the Black Ridge Precision Challenge. It will become the Walter Hayes Invitational, dedicated to honoring veterans, lifelong discipline, and the importance of respecting experience." For a brief moment the entire range became completely silent before warm applause filled the valley once again. Walter looked genuinely surprised. He slowly shook his head. "That is far more recognition than I deserve." Ethan smiled. "I thought the same thing this morning for a very different reason. I was wrong then, and I will not make the same mistake again." The crowd responded with another round of applause, not because of the announcement alone, but because they had witnessed two people demonstrate humility in different ways. Frank Donovan placed a hand on Walter's shoulder and quietly said, "You spent your life teaching people without realizing it." Walter looked across the range where Logan and several younger shooters were carefully watching the wind flags even though the competition had already ended. A gentle smile crossed his face. "If they leave today paying more attention than they did yesterday, then it was worth coming." Logan approached one final time before Walter headed toward his truck. "Sir," he said, "I hope I can shoot like you someday." Walter rested a hand lightly on the young man's shoulder. "Do not try to shoot like me. Learn to become the best version of yourself. That goal lasts much longer than any record." Logan nodded, knowing those words would stay with him for years. Walter climbed into his old pickup truck, placed the rifle case carefully on the passenger seat, and started the engine. Before driving away, he looked once more at the range where laughter had greeted him in the morning and respect now followed him into the evening. He raised one hand in a quiet farewell before the truck disappeared down the gravel road. Ethan remained standing beside the entrance until the vehicle was no longer visible. He then turned toward the scoreboard displaying the newly established record and realized that the numbers would eventually be broken again, just as every record someday is. What would endure far longer was the lesson every person carried home that day. True greatness does not announce itself with pride, expensive equipment, or loud words. It arrives quietly, earns respect through character, and reminds everyone fortunate enough to witness it that age can change appearance, but it can never diminish discipline, integrity, or the lasting value of a life lived with honor.